Start in a minute. Sorry about that. Hello and welcome. Welcome everybody to this talk that we are very proud to present. My name is Ana Elena González Treviño, and I'm the director of the Center for Mexican Studies of the National Autonomous University of Mexico in the United Kingdom, better known as UNAM UK. Our office is dedicated to promoting student exchange and academic collaboration, but also divulging Mexican culture and certifying the Spanish language. We offer an exam called CL, which is a standardized exam for knowledge of Spanish by foreign speakers. And today we are very, very proud and happy to present Birgitta Huse, who is going to talk about textiles. Birgitta is a social anthropologist who has lived in San Juan Chamula, in Chiapas, in the state of Chiapas, in Mexico, in southern Mexico, and has some fascinating insights about the dynamics of textiles and tourism and souvenirs and sustainability. She is a writer and an independent researcher, and she knows Mexico very well, in many cases, I'm sure better than myself. So we are very glad to have you here with us, Birgitta, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. So good afternoon, and thank you for your introduction, Ana Elena. It's very nice to be here, and I hope I can present what I know about Mexico. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today. Buenas tardes y bienvenidos. First of all, I want to thank Ana Elena González Treviño for inviting me to talk about my research. I also want to thank all the women in San Juan Chamula and San Cristobal de las Casas in Chiapas who have shared and continue to share their everyday life and specialist knowledge with me over the years. Without them, my work about textiles, clothes, and tourism in southern Mexico would not be possible. A research funding is crucial, especially for independent researchers, and I'm grateful for having received financial support by the Mexican Foreign Office, SRE, and CONACYT, and the German Academic Exchange Service, DAAD. Before I start, I ask you regarding housekeeping, please do not take photos of my slides. Please do not record my talk, neither as a video nor as an audio. If you later want to refer to something I talk about, please mention my name and the event with the title and the date. Thank you. Move to the next slide. This one up. Yes? No? Oh, so it should work then, no? Good. So I will start by shining a light on why and how I began my research about textiles, clothes, fashion, and tourism in southern Mexico in 1989. I will then continue to talk about the interconnectedness of the production and selling of textile souvenirs to tourists and the production and consumption of clothes by indigenous people using the example of embroidered blouses in San Juan Chamula. I will highlight crucial questions which my study raises, and I will put them into context in the second chapter. And finally, I will conclude with what I consider essential for future research. Why have I chosen the Mayan village of San Juan Chamula in the Highlands of Chiapas as the place for my first research in 1989-90, which was the base for my PhD dissertation? I had traveled to southern Mexico as a tourist in 1988, and as basically every tourist visiting the region does, went to see San Juan Chamula. The village is one of the indigenous villages which surround the city of San Cristobal de las Casas, which is especially known for the impressive landscape the city is located in and its colonial architecture. It was not only the Sunday market in front of the church in Chamula which left a lasting impression on me and aroused my interest. Children offered small souvenirs like dolls, macrame bracelets and belts to tourists. Indigenous women on the crafts market waited for clients with woolen shawls, embroidered cotton blouses, and more products for sale. The production process itself, namely the weaving with the backstrap loom, the embroidery, and the use of the macrame technique caught my attention, as most of the girls and women I saw were busy embroidering a cotton blouse or knotting a macrame bracelet or belt. Interested in a particular belt, I asked the woman who offered it how it was made. She explained how she wove it with her backstrap loom. I bought this belt believing that she had made it, only to find out much later that it was made in Guatemala instead. Why am I telling you this story? Firstly, my experience resembles what most tourists experience when visiting Chamula. Could these women make a good living selling their textile products to tourists? Secondly, my experience as a tourist sparked my social anthropological curiosity. Who produces the products on offer and how? Is the range of textile products on offer changing over time? Does the production and selling of textile products to tourists have an influence on indigenous textile production and consumption? My first research in Chamula and San Cristobal started with an analysis of souvenirs and products for local indigenous consumption. An analysis of the production and selling of souvenirs and tourists' interests and buying behavior followed. I looked at consequences in Chamula society regarding professional specialization, women's biographies, and gender roles. The book I published in 1994 gave an in-depth insight into Chamula textile culture and tourism, something that had not been done before. Later, I extended my fieldwork to include Yucatan, where Chamula women sell souvenirs to tourists, and my interest expanded towards long-term developments regarding indigenous textiles, clothes, and fashion consumption in relation to tourist demand. I'm especially interested in Chamula second-hand clothes. My long-term research in the Highlands of Chiapas shows that the production and selling of typical clothes as souvenirs to tourists is much more tied to the consumption of clothes by indigenous people than often assumed. In 1989, I observed that Chamula women sold black and brown woolen vests to tourists. Especially on Sundays, it was dozens of buses filled with around 70 tourists each arriving in Chamula. Due to an overwhelming tourist demand for woolen garments, Chamula women started to cut used skirts and other clothes in order to design souvenir vests. More embroidery, bigger but similar in design and color to the original embroidery on the garment, is added. This procedure allows for a quick and economic souvenir production, replacing the from-scratch production involving carding wool, producing the yarn, and backstrap loom weaving. An even better possibility, energy, time, and raw material-wise, is to sell own used blouses without any alterations. How do I approach the analysis of the interconnectedness of the selling of used second-hand clothes to tourists and indigenous clothes consumption here? Firstly, I concentrate on two popular pieces of clothing, the souvenir vest and the embroidered blouse worn by Chamula women. Secondly, I look at why tourists buy these second-hand products. And thirdly, I focus on what Chamula women do regarding their blouses and capture some of their perspectives on the matter. So these are Chamula authorities, which you would see on the Sunday market in Chamula. Why do tourists buy second-hand clothes? Tourist answers to a questionnaire which I developed and used during my first fieldwork revealed that products which tourists identify as typical for the region in terms of kind of product, design, and color were of interest. Everything handmade was attractive, and woven and embroidered items were considered especially authentic. The attraction was to buy from an indigenous woman. Black and brown woolen and embroidered vests fit into tourist souvenir loot scheme. Black and brown woolen garments like skirts and huipillas, which are rectangular blouses without cuts based on a sewing pattern. They are handmade and worn by the indigenous women and sold by the supposed weaver. Local traditions like typical clothing on markets are consumed, experienced, photographed by the tourist while visiting. The ownership of an authentic piece of clothing is key because the traditional knowledge and craftsmanship can thus be consumed repeatedly when back home again. The souvenir contains memories of the visit to an indigenous Maya village, the visited people, and the contact with the indigenous seller. This is similar for the used blouses which tourists buy. Tourists identify Chamula's women's second-hand blouses as authentic and traditional in the sense of a dress style that is typical since many years. The colorful adornment around the blouse neckline is hand-stitched, the proof of this being women seen in the village embroidering their blouses. The second-hand blouses are bought from indigenous market women wearing a similar blouse, like you can see here. An especially strong impulse for buying second-hand blouses as souvenirs is the fact that indigenous women wore them before. Elaborate embroidery on the blouses demonstrates experienced knowledge and attracts tourists' interest. Surprising is, though, that the blouse material is of little importance. The blouses are made of polyester. Furthermore, the trimmings, finishings, as well as the acrylic and other yarn used to embroider originate from industrial production. The blouses with trimmings are bought ready-made by Chamula women on the market in Chamula or in shop in San Cristobal de las Casas. The only part handmade by the woman who is wearing the blouse is the embroidery. Finally, many tourists would be surprised to learn that the use of these blouses in many different colors was only introduced in early 2000s. For indigenous women, the selling of used clothes provides a financial means for regular purchase of new blouses for themselves and thus enhances the continuous creation of new embroidery designs and fashion in terms of blouse style and color combinations, accessories included. When I first visited Chamula, all women and girls wore either a white or a blue synthetic blouse, which was embroidered with some few lines of tiny chain stitches in red. Independently from a woman's age, this was the continued standard for many years. Around a decade later, some crafts market women started to wear blouses in other colors. These fashionistas, as I call them, proudly presented themselves in orange, light or bright green or blue blouses. The color of the neckline embroidery, violet, for example, was altered to fit the color of the woven belt around the traditional woolen skirt. Over the years, synthetic blouses with different kinds of pleats appear. The colors change in fashionable waves from orange, green, and generally bright colors to black, dark brown, and copper, and then back again to brighter colors like rose and yellow or beige. The neckline embroidery expanded from some lines to covering the whole upper front of the blouse area. The embroidered lines were interrupted with some small flowers and stars to start with, then with more until the embroidered area appears to be covered by huge and elaborate flowers only. Over the years, changing embroidery techniques are used to embellish the personal blouses. Despite these general changes, we have to keep in mind that fashion is never uniform. That means that at a certain phase, a variety of fashions exists simultaneously. These days, rather sooner than later, and with an ever accelerating pace, a formerly fashionable blouse is offered to tourists. The diverse combinations of blouse color and embroidery color and design are a broad range of possible purchase choices for tourists and everyone interested in indigenous blouses. The uniqueness of each blouse adds to the attraction. The situation regarding the woolen vest is different. The turnaround with woolen clothes is much slower. To produce a new woolen garment involves a higher material cost, labor, and time, and is therefore not as easily done as is the case with blouses. For daily use, cardigans are bought as an alternative to woolen garments. Women in Chamula comment that cardigans have less weight, are warmer due to long sleeves, and sometimes new cardigans could be bought in different styles. Despite the use of cardigans in the everyday, woolen shawls did not disappear, especially during festive gatherings. Woolen garments are essential. Only those families who can afford better, long-haired and more appreciated woolen clothes would sell their used pieces. The supply of woolen clothes for tourists is much more limited than the one with synthetic blouses. My analysis of the interconnectedness of textile souvenir selling to tourists and the indigenous clothes consumption so far reveals a dynamic and fast-paced process of changing traditions. I'm not yet ready to talk about numbers of used clothes available and other important details. More research is needed, for which funding is necessary, to complement my already existing long-term study and give indications for future research. My study raises crucial questions and issues. Different disciplines, for example, social or cultural anthropology, arts and design, and economics, are involved in the study of textiles, fashion, and tourism, each focusing on a different aspect. In 2007, I presented a conference paper in Leeds which is called Maya Second-Hand Clothes as Souvenirs for Tourists, New Clothes for Indigenous People, Changing Material Culture in Mexico. At the conference, Things That Move the Material World of Tourism and Travel at the Center for Tourism and Cultural Change in Leeds. I talked about the process of transformation of material culture regarding tourism, souvenirs, clothes, and fashion in an indigenous society, stressing that various aspects and how they intertwine need to be analyzed. My pledge for an interdisciplinary development of new perspectives and ideas still holds true today. There's still much research to be conducted, especially when taking into consideration how quickly things change, not only in Chamula. By now, the degree of consciousness regarding supposed binary oppositions like fashion, tradition, authentic, non-authentic, and West, non-West has increased significantly. Some binary opposites, which were largely adhered to before, like traditional modern, for example, are, so to speak, completely out of fashion. The division between the West and the West is overcome in theory, though in research practice there's room for improvement. A lot more is yet to be learned about consumers and the process of consuming clothes, decision-making when buying, wearing, selling, or getting rid of clothes, especially in relation with tourism and globalization. I grapple with the definitions of tradition, tourists, cultural tourism, souvenirs, authenticity, clothing, and fashion throughout my work. The subtitle of this talk, which I put as Topsy-Turvy Traditions, No Secondhand Clothes as Souvenirs for Tourists Without New Fashionable Clothes for Indigenous Women, is posed as a provocation and to question existing associations, namely the one of traditions with Indigenous people and fashion with non-Indigenous people. In general, the use of the term tradition comes with a risk. Despite scholars' widely perception of traditions as developing dynamically, the term often sparks ideas of static habits and objects use featuring within an established and hardly changing group of people. This is a pitfall that often interlinks with work that involves Indigenous people. I choose topsy-turvy traditions to at least indicate that what follows in the second part of the talk's title probably is an unexpected turn: second-hand products for tourists and new clothes for Indigenous people. Thinking about the terms tourist and cultural tourism is important. A tourist is broadly defined as a person who travels and visits places for pleasure and interest. The definition of tourism from the United Nations World Tourism Organization mentions further aspects to be considered. Professional purposes are mentioned regarding the purchase of objects which a visitor considers to be typical for a region. It is important to be aware that the visitor might be an anthropologist or collector or else. Professional interests influence behavior while traveling, as exemplified with my first journey to Chamula. That's the second definition on the slide. The tourism organization defines or distinguishes between different categories of tourism, one being cultural tourism. So cultural tourism is a type of tourism activity in which the visitor's essential motivation is to learn, discover, experience, and consume the tangible and intangible cultural attractions, products in a tourism destination. These attractions and products relate to a set of distinctive material, intellectual, spiritual, emotional features of a society that encompasses arts and architecture, historical and cultural heritage, culinary heritage, literature, music, creative industries, and the living cultures with their lifestyles, value systems, beliefs, and traditions. These definitions highlight that tourists are not a homogeneous group. Different people have different interests and opinions about what is typical for a region, depending on their professional background, for example. Tourism categories are not as clear-cut in practice as they appear in theory. Many European tourists who visited Mexico in the 1980s, for example, combined an interest for culture and beaches. The concepts of consumption of attraction and traditions, the meaning and value of a souvenir and authenticity are important for answering the question of why tourists buy secondhand clothes. How exactly do tourists consume Chamula culture? Which meaning and value do the used clothes have for them as a souvenir? A souvenir is, quote, something that is given or kept as a reminder of a place, person, or event. It's a typically small and inexpensive item designed for sale to tourists and having some association with the place visited, end quote. Oxford Dictionary. This definition tackles two important aspects. Firstly, it says that the item would be designed for sale to tourists. This should be looked at very carefully. Not every souvenir is initially designed as such. Second-hand clothes, for example. The fact that stolen hotel towels are considered as souvenirs is eye-opening. A souvenir can be any object. Secondly, a souvenir is defined as having some association with the place visited. This implies accurately that the association made is neither all-embracing nor the same for everyone. A souvenir often functions as a representative for a certain indigenous group, like Maya or Nawa or any other group, or even for all indigenous people in Mexico. Another slippery term, which is nearly always part of the discussion when it comes to indigenous clothes, is authenticity. Authenticity is easily associated with something original, unique, and traditional in the sense of old, long existing. In contrast to these associations, what is considered as authentic varies from individual to individual. Authenticity is negotiated between the involved people during every single encounter. When distinguishing between clothing and fashion, clothing refers to the necessity and practicability of wearing clothes, whereas fashion is associated with certain clothing styles at a particular time. Compared to fashion, clothing sparks less interest for discussion. It is no coincidence that the terms clothes or dress are frequently used in connection with indigenous people, whereas the term fashion is key in discussions about what Western people wear. In 2004, I highlighted in a German book publication regarding existing research, a destruction, quote, a destruction and disappearance of indigenous and other traditional textile culture is often complained about, especially in connection with tourism. Scientific works about changes of Mesoamerican textile cultures basically focus on the following. Firstly, historic contexts. Secondly, clothes and identity and a Western influence on them. And thirdly, the influence of tourism on a given textile craft with a detailed look at products produced for tourists. For example, Holzbeke, Montoya, Hendrickson, and my own work. Analysis were hardly, if at all, put into broader cultural contexts, considering contemporary developments in a given society. For example, Hendrickson, Huse, or for Nepal by Hepburn. End quote. In contrast to today, the anthropological study of themes related to tourism was very unusual in German ethnology towards the end of the 1980s. Instead of living with a more or less isolated indigenous community and learn about their rituals, beliefs, and organization, the study of souvenir production and selling meant research at an easily accessible place frequented by tourists and observing indigenous tourist interactions. That reminds me, Ana Elena said, I lived in San Juan Chamula. I didn't actually. I lived in San Cristobal because people wouldn't let me live in Chamula. At that time, no one else lived in Chamula. So I was traveling there and spent all my days there. I was able to spend 2 or 3 nights there because I was supposedly too drunk. That's what the women said, but that was an exception. So that just to mention that I lived in San Cristobal, really. So at that time, it was predominantly geographers who worked on the influence of tourism on the visited people, mainly tackling economic questions. The kind and quality of products for tourists were analyzed. Mexican curious airport art were the terms, and it was mostly concluded that objects produced for tourists would be inferior to authentic objects for indigenous consumption in terms of material, design collaboration, and craft performance. In the United States, anthropologist Nelson Graben discussed ethnic tourist art in 1976 within the emerging field of anthropology of tourism. So that was a very new thing to do, really. Referring to anthropological studies, Hansen states in 2004 that clothes consumption was of more interest since the 1980s. Examining stylistic choice as a complex and heterogeneous process, contemporary anthropological work has moved beyond the idea of emulation to embrace notions of bricolage, hybridity, and creolization. Clarifying these dynamics and the power that shaped them is at the heart of today's anthropological study of dress, end quote. Despite this, as Küchler and Weir have already pointed out in 2005, we still know little about what people actually do with clothing. This is especially true if we look at clothing in connection with tourism in Mexico and Latin America. Tourism is often not a theme in anthropological work about clothing. If it is, it's generally referred to as an important factor for change, mainly for economic reasons, like Feminia's, Sawn, and others. There are only very few examples, the works of Hepburn and Sawn, 2004 being two, where the effects of tourism are also studied with respect to indigenous dress practice. My analysis of existing research so far culminates in the following. Until today, academic research is strongly influenced by the dividing distinction between indigenous, authentic material culture on one hand, and airport art and souvenirs for tourists on the other, which was common in the 70s, 80s already, distinction. Anthropologists, textile art historians, and textile designers rather work on so-called authentic, traditional, or indigenous textiles. Anthropologists being especially interested in identity construction. A manageable number of social anthropologists and textile and fashion experts concentrates on Latin American, like Rude, Latin American Fashion Reader in 2005. Being interested in changes in clothes worn by indigenous people and the Latin American influence on global fashion. An early forerunner for Mexico is social anthropologist Susana Drucker. She documented the change of clothing and analyzed possible reasons in Santiago, Jamiltepec, Mixteca, Oaxaca, and published her book Cambio de Indumentaria as early as 1963. Following the above-mentioned long-standing academic tradition, the study of objects for tourists is not considered as worth the in-depth study within the long-established mainstream of social anthropological discipline. It is tourism specialists working on souvenirs and related aspects, textile, dress, and fashion scholars, separate from tourism scholars, and vice versa. The long-term dominance of an association of so-called traditional dress with a non-West versus the association of fashion with the West in scholarship had, as we now know, only limited possibilities for the analysis of clothes consumption to offer, primarily relying on binary divisions, does not produce the most interesting and challenging research results, as the more complicated realities are not captured. The distinction between traditional and non-Western on one hand and fashionable and Western on the other disappears continuously. Indigenous fashion is recognized. In 2007, I proposed the interdisciplinary study of indigenous fashion, dress, clothes, and garment. I wrote an article about Maya fashion in 2009 for a magazine for specialists working with indigenous people. In 2014, Angela Jansen and Maike Feitsma contested the above dichotomy in scholarship with a presentation of their comparative study of fashion in Morocco and the Netherlands, which they approached with a combination of anthropology of dress, fashion theory, and culture studies. To sum up, my approach is as follows. So it's basically the social anthropology, fashion business and tourism research, and then it's especially Maya fashion, second-hand clothes, traditional cultural expressions, which is the TCE, and indigenous knowledge or traditional knowledge, cultural appropriation in the business area, and obviously also the souvenir area. So it's a really broad area and sometimes difficult to handle and to tackle. So having an outlook on challenging perspectives, what do we need? I think we need more research regarding the interconnectedness of the selling of souvenirs to tourists and indigenous clothing consumption and fashion. Then I would say we need more research about tourists, our attitudes and behavior regarding the buying of textile souvenirs and clothing. We need research about indigenous clothing consumption and fashion creation, long-term research in more world regions, and research with an interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary approach which addresses souvenirs, clothes, and fashion. Especially since the pandemic, many more Mexican tourists visit indigenous villages in Chiapas than it was the case in the 80s and 90s, when mainly European tourists and US American anthropologists were interested in Maya culture in southern Mexico. So actually nowadays it's around 80 to 84%, depending on the month, of Mexican tourists visiting San Cristobal and Chiapas generally. So it's a very high percentage of Mexican tourists, and it would only be 20% of US American and other European tourists, the biggest group being French people. So it would be like 30% within the 20% of tourists from other countries than Mexico who would visit Chiapas, and it would be like 8 to 9% Germans and US American tourists. So that also changed a lot since I've been there for the very first time. Political circumstances have changed. Indigeneity is now at the center of many debates. Cultural misappropriation as a theme has made its way from academic discussion to the public realm. The number of businesses with indigenous textiles and fashion has grown tremendously, not only in Chamula, but nationwide in Mexico and internationally, especially in the United States. Many more people than in the last decades of the 20th century and the first years of the 21st century are interested in Mexican textiles and fashion. And last but not least, as the World Tourism Organization states, tourism has the potential to contribute to greater gender equality and the empowerment of women in line with Sustainable Development Goal number 5. So the majority of people employed in tourism is women all over. I look forward to intensified interdisciplinary research together with social anthropologists, textile specialists, fashion scholars, and tourism researchers, to name some possibilities. To understand what is happening in Chamula and elsewhere is essential. In my opinion, future research should help to better understand the dynamics of textile souvenirs and indigenous fashion. This understanding needs to enhance challenging perspectives and spark new ideas for collaborative activities with indigenous artisans. These collaborative activities should aim at cultural sustainability, which in this case means the possibility for indigenous women to make or to continue making an independent living based on their specialist textile knowledge and their competence in the future. Very important is to consider intra-cultural status differences in Chamula and elsewhere. Long-term engagement and being truly on par with everyone involved is really crucial. And finally, I would like to ask you for your help. Because I'm looking for people who bought textile souvenirs in Mexico, especially in the Highlands of Chiapas, while traveling and or bought those somewhere else. Maybe you even have a whole collection of Mexican textiles or know about someone who has. If you would like to tell me about your or other people's pieces, please let me know your contact details. Those of you attending in person here in London can do so here with me on a list. And those of you attending online are welcome to write an email to me. Yeah, that's the bibliography, and the email is down there. And well, thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Birgitta. And would anyone like to comment or ask any questions?
Yeah, thank you. I'd be very interested to hear like your personal account of what was San Juan Chamula like when you arrived. I know that in the late 80s, early 90s, they were quite hostile towards foreigners, and especially it was forbidden to take photographs. So if you can tell us a bit about that and why you put the smiley face on some of your photos.
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. That's really a great question. And actually, in those days, and that's also why I didn't live in San Juan Chamula, so they didn't want anyone else living there. And I had a camera and didn't use it until young girls, basically, and teenagers were asking me if I wouldn't have a camera. And I said, yeah, well, I do have. And yeah, why don't I take photos of them? They would like some photos of them. But then we would go behind a building when no one was there, so like hidden. And this young girl wanted a photo, which I took in black and white, actually. I don't know now why I did that. So I started like this. And then it was several women who saw photos of the family. And the whole thing developed nearly that I was like, I called myself like a court photographer a little bit. So I was asked to come to certain events and take photos, because later I gave the photos to the women. But then they knew I'm around and I'm reliable. I put smileys even until today on the faces. So I wouldn't sell these images or something. There are some images published. So I always use basically the same images again. And in those years, also some tourists ended up in jail in San Juan Chamula. So they took photos thinking, oh, people wouldn't realize it. And it was realized, and they were, the camera was taken away, or the film in those times, there was no digital camera, the film was taken out. So they lost all their holiday photos. So it was actually sort of hostile environment. And over the years, that changed completely. So over the years, because I went there nearly every second year or every year regularly, Chamula women on the market discovered they could sell photos. So they were selling their souvenirs, and if a tourist wanted to take a photo, they offered it for a certain price, which I think is fair, no? So imagine you're sitting there, and they're like, I don't know, 20, 30 buses coming with so many tourists, and everyone is taking photos, no? So it's really like, it's too much simply. And now you have Chamula women selling on Instagram and putting photos of their family and what they're doing. And so that's the thing. So I think when a woman decides herself to do that, I'm fine with that. But my position is a different one. So I wouldn't really do that without asking the consent of that woman, really. And that's why I sort of unfortunately also showed not that many photos. Obviously, I have many, many more photos. No, but I don't really feel like it.
But sorry, one more question. So basically, they believe that if you take a photograph of them, their spirit will be taken away from them, or something like that. No.
Well, that was the story which is always told, or which was always told. But I think it's also to defend yourself on all these masses of photos. Huh? But now it's part of the culture as well via Instagram. So many households don't have a computer, but they use the phone, and there are millions of photos. But it's a very important question how to deal with that. Also, as consumers, if we look at Facebook, if we look at Instagram, we send photos. Also with my talk, asking not to take photos of the slides and things, because everything is around everywhere, and you don't have any control really of it. No? And then I think, yeah, well, they use a phone and they travel, and they're, especially the women, they're business women very often. So maybe there's an idea about sewing. We couldn't generalize it, I think. So I think it's simply a question of respect. No? Do I go around this room and take a photo of everyone here and say, oh, look, she has been to my talk, and publish it, or don't I do it? Or do I ask, no? Do you want that? Or so
Thank you.
yeah.
You mentioned the first item that you bought in Chamula was actually made in Guatemala. So just what I'm picking up is that there's a whole factory world or home factory world in homes that are making these things, and then there's women who are selling them, so that there's a supply chain going there. Is that correct, or if I just made that up?
Yeah, that's also a very, very good question, because if I look back at that time when I did my research, it was really very often that woman who produced these things. Though, as with the belt from Guatemala, there were some smaller things like little bags or belts, which would be bought from Guatemalan traders which crossed the border, or who crossed the border or going to Guatemala. So they were around everywhere. And then I researched about the products, and I talked about the professional specialization. And that's exactly what happened over the years, because the tourists are going to the center, to the cabecera in Chamula, and the many other women living in the hamlets, they wouldn't have access to sell in the cabecera to tourists. So it would be actually them producing things and the women on the market in Chamula selling it. And besides, weaving with a backstrap loom can't be done where many tourists are around and where you have to interrupt your work every minute because a tourist is asking something, and you need space and you need to focus when you're doing backstrap loom weaving. So that's not done. So somewhere these things have to come from. And then today, and that's also what I want to, or what I need to really do some research about, because there's much, much more going on regarding these supply chains, really. You know, like people paying women for piecework, or just for embroidery, big fashion brands do that. So there's all sorts of things going on. And that's exactly why I want to research regarding these aspects. Now, what is going on with the products for tourists, and what is going on with many, many other products, and where do they come from, and who's selling them, and how does this intertwine? What does it change in society in Chamula? It's really, yeah, I'm really curious about that myself.
There are a couple of questions from people on Zoom. Richard Maudsley from the British Mexican Society is asking, is it still possible to buy the superb traditional woven huipiles in San Juan Chamula that local women used to make and sell in the late 1970s and early 1980s?
I think so, but it's not that often. So I feel it comes in waves. That's another thing regarding this. Also very interesting question, because I have the feeling that it might be also when someone is dying or someone is selling clothes, or I don't know how that exactly works. And then you would be able to buy these things. But the very precious ones, so it's like this, the longer the hair on these woolen garments, the more material is in it and the more they are valued. And as I said in my talk, families would only sell those if they would produce better ones. So to really get the really good ones is difficult. Probably if you approach the woman being there, this could be possible. You never know, but it's a whole width of products, and then it's also collectors buying. So it's, as I said, tourists. We are all not just tourists. We are collectors. We are anthropologists. We are economists or whatever, and we have our interests when we buy a certain item for whatever, for collection, for wearing it, like I bought this blouse, or what for do we buy these things? So, yeah, thank you, Richard.
And then there's Isis Kiwen. She says, thank you, Dr. Huse. My question is, if the research suggests there is less labor involved in souvenirs than before, as individual seller, and more work and authenticity in groups or collectives. Also, I'd like to know your opinion of designer brands working with indigenous groups making collections. Many greetings from Switzerland.
Oh yeah, thank you. Greetings back to Switzerland, and thank you for your question. Fashion brands use a lot of workload from indigenous women all over Mexico, designs. So there are many examples for that, really, and there's much difference as well. So fashion brand is not like similar to fashion brand. And I would be very careful if someone says we are working sustainable and we are involving indigenous women. That's why I said collaborative activities with new ideas, because now the broad idea is, yeah, we go out there and we somehow involve indigenous people, and then that's a good thing to do. So, question mark. So one has to look at it very closely, really. And in terms of souvenirs, I just picked the blouses because obviously there are many more products. So you can't generally say the souvenirs are of a bad quality because, for example, like this blouse, which now you wouldn't get anymore, it's a tiny embroidery and it would take a lot of time. So it's millions of different products of different quality. So one has to actually look at what is going on. And also regarding cooperatives, they are learning old techniques again, like brocade weaving and other techniques, which is very good, I think, and the quality is very good. But then there are also certain dynamics depending on the cooperatives. So basically, I'm questioning all the things. You can't say cooperatives are good and big fashion brands are bad. So you really have to look at the single case, what is actually going on. And very often in the cooperatives, it's also like a head or people responsible and many women doing the work. So you also can't be sure that generally it's a fantastic thing going on. No? So it depends very much, yeah, who does it and what is going on. The intention is often very good, but then looking at certain case studies, I find, or I question if it's really, if that's the solution. And what I most miss is really, and that's why I made a point of it at the end, to work together with Indigenous women, not in the sense that I'm selling blouses and the Indigenous woman knows how to embroider it, but to work together in a different way, really, in terms of decision making and markets. And so I think there's a lot room for different and new ways to work together, because it's not anymore the anthropologist going there doing a study about Chamula. That's also another thing I'm struggling with. How do I do my research? Because obviously it's not as it has been. So I also have to do a very different research. I don't know if the word even is appropriate anymore. It's more of a collaboration, a collaborative project. And then I would have to see what women there find important. So it's not about me only, what I find important. It's about all those Chamula women, what they find important. And then talking about all those, where they're individual people, obviously, no? So you have all sorts of people. That's really changed a lot, really. And I think there's a lot to do and have close looks at this, especially as there are more and more people really making money selling Mexican clothes.
Can I just ask about the tourists themselves? So while you were doing the research, did you have a chance to speak to tourists as well and what they intended to do with the blouses? So you've mentioned some people wearing them and some people maybe putting them away as part of a collection, and what the motivation was and the breakdown, as it were.
Yeah, so
It's
I had my,
interesting.
well, thank you also for your question. Also, just thinking about those times, I had my questionnaire, and in the evenings, I went to the hotels in San Cristobal de las Casas, because the usual thing would be the tourists would go for a morning to Chamula. And in the afternoon, they would have some free time, spare time to spend in San Cristobal. In the evening, they would be in the hotel, because the next morning early, they would leave to Palenque. So I went to the hotels and asked after they had their dinner, or while they were waiting for their dinner, and everyone filled in this paper. And then it was like many wanted to use it and many wanted to give it away as a gift, but it wasn't very precise. So looking at it now, I got many answers, but quite general, really. No? And then when I was there, obviously, I also spoke with many tourists, more so as I took photos of tourists. So I was sitting on the floor with Chamula women and tourists trying to make photos of Chamula women. I was taking photos of the tourists who sometimes were really annoyed about that. No? And then we started to talk, and I said, yeah, are you going to buy? What are you going to do? And over the years, it's more people wearing these things, actually. But then the question is, for how long? So I would say they come back from a holiday and then you're like, oh, wow, I went to Mexico, and you wear certain colorful blouses. And then it gets autumn in London, it gets gray and rainy, and the memories of the holiday fades away. And then you maybe put it on a wall or you show it to friends at home. Maybe you don't wear it anymore. So also the souvenir has a life, and that's what I also want to know. That's why I'm looking for people who have bought things to exactly find out more about this side. But obviously it has to be narrow, because I can't ask every tourist worldwide who did that. So I somehow have to think about whom I'm asking. And as I'm in London, so I start with what is around in London, because there are many people going to Mexico for all sorts of reasons.
I just wondered if there might be any connection with if the tourists are on a tour, some gala dinners that you dress up the last evening in these blouses, and that's part of the incentive to buy.
Well, I don't know, because at that time I didn't know about what's going to happen at the end. So they started in Mexico City, and then the typical
Yes.
tourism corridor of those times, like passing Oaxaca, going to San Cristobal. So San Cristobal was somewhere in the middle. So I don't know what happened at the beginning or at the end.
Yeah.
So I don't know about that bit. And I suppose many tourists, when coming back home, it's too colorful maybe. So you're captured by the people, the environment,
Yes,
the village and everything. It's fascinating. And then, yeah, what do you do
It's
with
like
it?
buying an Egyptian galabeer.
For example, yeah,
Which I've done.
exactly. So that's also why I asked, what do we think? What is our behavior regarding souvenirs? What do we do with it?
How about like modern Mexican designers? Like there's one guy, Remigio Mesta, and he goes to Oaxaca a lot and he works with like Oaxacan artisans to make really nice huipiles. But I don't know if that's the same in San Juan Chamula. Is this an equivalent of a sort of an effort to modernize these clothes?
Mhm. Well, that's actually, if you have a look online as well, in Instagram, for example, that's what Chamula women are doing. And that's where cultural appropriation and misappropriation and business comes in, I think, because it's often designers who are trained to do this. So they have a certain approach to textiles and know what they're doing. Chamula women work with textiles for ages or centuries, not themselves, but their families. So it's a tradition as well. They have a lot of knowledge, which is often quite different from what designers know and how they approach all of these things. And Chamula women also modernized. So also the souvenirs changed, or now they put other embroideries on the woolen things. The stitches changed. So it's also my question mark. You have designers who do that, who involve, and they learn from each other. And then you have also Chamula women, where's their place to design and to do, and who's earning the money. So there are many designers actually in Mexico doing things, like Carla Fernandez, for example. She's also working together with Indigenous women. And as far as I know, the people who are inventing sort of new designs or new figures to put in the middle of a skirt or something, as far as I read, they have got the property right. So that's another thing in terms of cultural appropriation. Who finally ends up with the property right? So who's really selling it? Who's making the money out of it? And then naturally everyone now says, yeah, I involve Indigenous people and we are on eye level. And fashion generally is very like sustainability as well. So it's like this whitewashing or greenwashing and sustainability. And I would say it's the same for all of these things. No? So it's really, have a look online, how open is the person, do they publish, how they do it, do they name the Indigenous people they're working with, or so that's an indicator as well. No? So how transparent is the information? Generally, if there's a little information and it's very broad, it's very easy to say, yeah, I'm sustainably working with Indigenous people. Great. So, but who is looking at it if that really happens? So that's, and I would be happy to just arise interest to have a close look at it. And I hope with this talk as well that now you see something and you see design, that you think about it. No, who does it? How does it look like? What does it have to do with traditional forms? What is traditional? All these things.
Thank you.
Many, many, many questions. Really. Yeah.
There are a couple from Zoom, new ones. Well, Richard says thank you for an interesting answer to his question. And Maria del Pilar Pérez Cruz, I'm going to read this in Spanish. Felicidades. Más que pregunta, es que realmente vendan esas piezas de arte a precios justos y ayudar a esas comunidades a vivir de las riquezas con las que cuentan y pocos conocen. Bendiciones por su bella labor. So,
Muchísimas gracias.
And then the League of Artisans, they are attending on Zoom, and they say that the League of Artisans has co-created an artisan manifesto summarizing what they want from such relationships with fashion and textile brands in particular. This was written over 12 months or more, the manifesto, created with the words of artisans around the world, including several from Mexico. And he has published, or she, a link, which I will share with you afterwards. And then the same League of Artisans says, question, do you think the new Mexican legislation around cultural appropriation is having any effect?
Wow. Thank you for the question. Yeah, I lately gave a talk in spring about culture, about misappropriation. That's where I had a talk just around that theme. And there's a German saying which says like, if you don't have a judge or policeman around, you never know what's going on. So it's one thing to have the law, but then it's another thing to ensure what's going on. And I feel that basically the whole thing is around property rights. And I investigated about this also with the League about textiles, and that various organizations who have their manifestos and explanations worked on with Indigenous women to say what they need and what they really want. No? So I think to be more aware is good. But then the other thing is like, if you have someone, let's say a Mexican designer who, I'm just expressing it very broadly, no? Like, and just using the labor of Indigenous women, is he on the safe side just because he's Mexican? So that's also the question, no? So I think it's good to have risen awareness that the cultural minister wrote letters to fashion brands, to Shein and many others. And then you would have absurd situations where a French fashion label would be fighting with another European fashion label about the rights of Mexican indigenous designs. And then it would be the indigenous women saying it's neither yours nor yours, it's ours, no? So it's really, I think it has an effect, to sum up, as the problem is made more public, because it has been in every newspaper, what Alejandra Frausto did with her letters. But the effect, well, I can't really answer that. I hope it has some effect, but which one and how it works, really, I don't know.
Would anyone else like to comment?
Just one quick question. You mentioned that when you first went, the blouses were polyester, that they were embroidered. Is it still polyester, or have they moved to different fabrics?
Well, when I went, it was basically like this. Before it was like without blouses, the wool repeal, and then it was white cotton backstrap loom woven blouses with tiny embroidery. Then it was like, this is manta, bought on the market, but it's obviously well embroidered. Then these manta blouses would be sold to tourists with huge embroidery. So I've got blouses which are covered from top to bottom with huge embroidery of maize plants, corn plants, completely different. At that time when I went, it was synthetic blouses, blue and white, with very few lines of embroidery, just like 2-3 lines. And then, like around the beginning of the 2000s, all of a sudden you will have all these cream-colored, brown, pleated, non-pleated, all sorts of blouses. So now, if you look at women in Chamula, you would have the similarities or the different fashions at the same time. So you would have all sorts of blouses, but then you could also see who can afford to buy the latest fashion. And at that time, when I went, I first thought, oh, everyone looks the same, because I didn't distinguish the subtleties. There were differences as well, but I haven't been able to distinguish when I first went. Over the years, I was also able to see which kind of blouse, which kind of embroidery, has the blouse holes, is it used, is it a new one really? No, but then, so that has really changed so much, because you would really see that. And besides, it's like earrings and the hairstyle changed and shoes. So when I came, most of the women were walking without shoes. Now it depends on which kind of shoes and how often do we have new shoes? Do they look used? Nail polish and all sorts of things which didn't exist when I went there. So that changed completely. And it's not that much time. No? If you remember, it was at the beginning of the 90s. So basically it's like 35 years. So it's not that much. And the changes I witnessed over all these years, it's just breathtaking. It's really breathtaking.
Okay, thank you very much, Birgitta, for a fascinating talk. There were so many questions from everywhere. So thank you once again. And I invite everyone who has attended either here or via Zoom to keep up with your work, to look forward to your upcoming book as well, published by Bloomsbury. That is going to be published by.
It's an article rather.
An
Yeah,
article.
So
Oh,
it's
an
not a
article.
book, it's an article.
It's an article. Okay, for your art.
Mhm.
Thank you very much. And
Well, thank you. Please remember to tell me about your Mexican textiles. Thank you so much.